Cool. So thanks guys for coming to this. I hope that you guys find this relevant and interesting. It's a model that I built during my master's and finished recently during my PhD. Um, and it's really focused on kind of the individual, maybe up to the society level. But I'm very curious about how you guys think that this might apply to like multi-scale architecture and basal cognition and the sorts of really cool things you guys work on. So um, yeah, this model is an attempt to try to understand reconstructive social learning, which I'll get to. But I'm a biologist interested in the evolution of learning. And so we can think of learning in two main kind of categories. The first is individual learning, where an animal interacts with the environment, or any system, not even just an animal. An organism interacts with the environment and gains some information from that interaction and updates its behavior in some way. And social learning is where an individual interacts not with the environment, but with other individuals. So for instance, these vervet monkeys will copy the food preferences of their group mates, even above their own food preferences. And the theory of when either kind of learning should or should not evolve has been developed for a few decades and has reached a pretty broad consensus, which is based on environmental variability. I'm just focusing on temporal variability for this talk. The consensus says that if the environment never changes, then we don't expect learning to evolve because genetic selection can approximate a very stable environment easily. Uh, and if the environment changes really often, then we expect individual learning to evolve. Individual learning is very reliable because the organism directly interacts with the current state of the environment, but it's assumed that there's a pretty high cost usually because you have to explore the environment, expose yourself to risks and uncertainties. And then only in this intermediate region of environmental change rate do we expect social learning to evolve. Social learning requires a relatively stable environment. If the environment changes all the time and you're learning from another individual, there's a good chance that that information is already outdated. Um, the benefit of social learning, at least according to these models, is that it's less costly because the organism could just stay home in its nest away from danger instead of having to go explore the environment itself. And by the way, you guys can just interrupt me anytime if you have a question. So um, these models, which develop the consensus view, have been built on replicative social information transmission, which is basically born from memetics, in which the social learning process is conceptualized of as copying. Uh, so discrete copying of traits, perhaps with some exogenous mutation to introduce variation. But there's been that approach has been criticized because it's very simple and because a lot of socially transmitted traits can't be easily discretized in this way. So there's an alternative approach that's been developed, the so-called Paris School of Cultural Evolution, in which social learning is thought of as a reconstructive process. So when a learner is exposed to some social information, they don't just copy it, but they actually reconstruct the information based on what they're given, but also things they've previously learned, their genes, their current neural state, anything about their current phenotype that influences the transmission process. So this might be a more realistic way to think about learning in complex systems, but it hasn't been modeled because it's complex. And so that is what we've tried to do in the paper that I'm presenting right now. So we use an agent-based evolutionary simulation where each agent is trying to learn an environment. And the environment is a relationship between cues and some qualities. So for instance, cues are something that are easy to observe in the environment. Quality is something that's harder to observe, but actually influences fitness. And this environmental relationship is always a bell-shaped curve bounded from the domain -1 to 1. Then each agent has a small neural network. These networks take as an input a value for the cue. As an output for each cue, they produce some prediction of the environment. So I just drew the prediction of a sample neural network in blue over the environment. This would be a neural network that's predicting the environment very well. This would be the output of a neural network that's predicting the environment very poorly. And so how do we incorporate learning into this model? We worked learning in as a series of discrete episodes. In each learning episode, first, a cue is picked from the environment. either picked by the learner based on one that has a high expected quality or randomly assigned. And then the error is calculated, which is just the difference between the learner's prediction of the Q and the actual quality of that Q. And then using the delta rule, just the last layer of network weights are changed to reduce this error. So when learning occurs, only part of the network is changed, and there's still a lot of the network that doesn't change via learning. It's kind of the idea that when you learn, you don't rewire your entire brain. You can change the strength of some connections, but you can't restart. So there's inborn parts of the network that don't change from learning. In social learning, we tested two different implementations of social learning. So the first is guided social learning, which you can think of as like one monkey going around the jungle foraging, and another individual is following it, and it's eating the same foods, but it's not actually directly copying the preferences of the leader. So this is like stimulus enhancement or emulation, perhaps from the ethology literature. So for social learning, we have a teacher now, a demonstrator, and I've just plotted in this purple line a sample demonstrator's neural network output, which is just another individual from the population. In social learning, the teacher now picks the cue, a cue with a high expected quality to that teacher. And then the learner uses the delta rule to learn the environment at that cue. So it's just the same as individual learning. The only difference is that the teacher picks the cue instead of the learner picking the cue to learn from. Imitation is the other kind of social learning we tested. It's a much stricter form of social learning in which the learner directly copies the preferences of the teacher. So once again, the teacher picks the learning cue, but now the error that goes into the delta rule is not the difference between the learner's prediction and the environment. It's the difference between the learner's prediction and the teacher's prediction. So after an episode of imitative social learning, the learner's neural network becomes more similar to the teacher's. So you can see that this is a lot worse if the teacher's prediction is not very accurate. And this is how we really tried to incorporate reconstruction versus replication. They're not copying any direct information from the teacher, but rather they're trying to reconstruct some information given by the teacher. So that's how we've implemented learning. After the individuals learn, they forage, and this is how they actually get fitness based on their prediction of the environment. And it's pretty simple. 10 random cues on the domain -1 to 1 are offered. The agent picks the cue with the highest predicted quality, and they gain energy equal to the quality, the actual quality of that cue. And that's repeated 500 minus the number of learning episodes they did. When I show how the simulation works, that'll make sense. But basically, all the time in their life that they spend not learning, they can spend foraging. And so you can see that, like in this example, if the agent had picked the cue to the right, it actually would have gotten more payoff. So that's how we've implemented learning and foraging. The way that the simulation actually works, each agent has 38 genes. 34 of those control the network weights and biases. So though these networks are genetically evolving alongside all the learning that's happening. There's a gene for the number of learning episodes that the agent does. There's a gene for the percentage of those learning episodes that are social learning, and the rest are individual learning. So with those two genes, these agents can evolve very specific learning strategies where they do a lot of individual learning, a lot of social learning, a mix of both, or no learning at all. Then they also have genes for the learning rate in the delta rule, a different one for individual learning and for social learning. If we take any given generation, there's always 1,000 individuals per generation. It's a constant population size. Each individual learns for a number of learning episodes as determined by their gene for that. And a percentage of those learning episodes are social learning, as determined again by their gene for that. If they do social learning, they pick an individual from the parental generation at random to use as a teacher. And then after their learning, they reproduce proportional to the total energy that they gain during foraging. The offspring that they produce inherit their genes, but they don't inherit the learn changes to the network. All of the genes for each offspring have some probability of mutation. And then in between generations, there's a chance of environmental change. And if the environment changes, it's pretty simple. We just shift the mean of the environmental curve to the point that if it goes across the edge of the domain -1 to 1, it just wraps around the other side. So there's often like two peaks in the environment, like you can see in these cases. And for all simulations, this is repeated 20,000 times to get 20,000 generations. So here's the first set of results. This is for allowing only individual learning to evolve. So the percentage of social learning is just fixed to 0. And each facet shows the environmental change regime. So the columns show how often the environment is changing. The rows show how large those changes are when they occur. Each data point gives the average population strategy evolved after 20,000 generations. The x-axis showing the number of learning episodes that they evolve, and the y-axis in this plot is just noise added, so it doesn't mean anything. And the color of each point shows how well the networks performed relative to if they had picked the best queue during foraging every single time. So just looking at these results, we can see that when the environment's very stable, so this top left facet, the environment changes only once every 100 generations, and the changes are small. Learning does not evolve, like 0 learning episodes or close to it for all of the replicates. So these individuals are just using genetic evolution to approximate the environment. And then in these more unstable environments, all of the environments that change every generation, we see a learning strategy evolving with about 20 learning episodes. And then in a few of these environments that are more intermediate, there's a mixed strategy where some populations evolve to learn, and some populations evolve to not learn. And the learning populations have higher performances, which is what we'd expect. So that's for just individual learning. Now we can add in the ability for social learning to evolve. These results are for guided social learning, which was the first kind of social learning that I showed, where the teacher picks the cue, but then the individual does individual learning on that cue. And same kind of plot, but now the y-axis shows the percentage of social learning that evolved. Once again, each point is the evolve strategy by a single population. So this is recapitulating what we expected to see and what the consensus view showed us based on the models of replicative social learning. In the very stable environment, learning does not evolve. In the very unstable environment at the bottom right, individual learning evolves. And then in the intermediate environments, we get some nice social learning strategies where there's about 50% social learning and like 20 learning episodes. So that's cool. That's, I guess, what we expected to see. What about for imitative social learning? This is the very strict form of social learning where the social learners don't actually learn the environment, but they just learn the teacher's prediction. And now we see clearly social learning is not evolving. We get no learning in the stable environment, and then we get individual learning evolving in a lot of these environments. But there's no environments where we actually have an attractor appearing for social learning. So this was kind of surprising because the consensus view says in an intermediate environment, social learning should evolve. So to investigate why social learning might not be evolving, we took this, this environment, the most intermediate environment, and we ran a bunch of simulations trying out different improvements to social learning to see which one might help social learning get off the ground. The first one we tried was a success bias. So previously, teachers just picked individuals at random to be teachers. Now, we allow learners to pick teachers proportional to how well those teachers actually performed in their lifetime. So a success bias just means that they're more likely to have a teacher that actually predicts the environment well. But you can see that adding the success bias didn't really increase the evolution of social learning. We also tried making social learning cheaper. So we made it so that each episode of social learning only has 10% the cost of an episode of individual learning, meaning that 10 social learning episodes take up the amount of foraging time that would be used for one individual learning episode. But you can see that decreasing the cost of social learning also did not increase the rate of social learning strategies evolving. And then we allowed the schedule to evolve. Um, so by schedule, I mean that we allowed the agents to evolve the order and time in which they do social learning versus individual learning. Without the schedule evolution, they just randomly do social learning and individual learning episodes interspersed in time. But allowing the schedule to evolve, they could either do all of their individual learning episodes and then all of their social learning, or all of their social learning and then all of their individual learning. And once we allow this, even without the other improvements, but especially with them, we have an attractor appear where a social learning strategy consistently evolves. And in all cases, it's associated with the social learning first schedule. So these agents do all of their social learning and then all of their individual learning. This was surprising, but the intuition for it is that social learning basically it gets you in the ballpark of the environmental peak because a teacher can give you a few good cues that are close to that environmental peak that is most important to learn, but it's unreliable. So it won't really fine tune you on the exact environment at that point. Individual learning is slower because the individuals have to explore for themselves, but it's very reliable. So the social learning first strategy makes sense because they get close to the environmental optimum, the peak, by the teacher's cues, and then they do individual learning to really refine their predictions around that peak. So this was a surprising and exciting result. And we wanted to see if social learning then evolved in all of the other environments. That was just for the very intermediate environment, but we ran again for the different environmental change regimes, imitative social learning with all of these improvements. So the success bias, the reduced cost, and the schedule. And now you see that in several of these intermediately variable environments, we get the social learning strategy evolving, again, associated with the social learning first strategy. But it's interesting that even in this environment, where we expect social learning to be the best, we still have the other strategies evolving. So there's this no learning strategy evolving in several replicates, and there's an individual learning strategy that still evolves in about half of the replicates, as well as the social learning strategy. So we wanted to kind of get an idea of what's actually happening in this environment. So I ran 1,000 simulations with that environmental change regime and took data from the populations exploring this parameter space to create a fitness landscape to see what fitness populations are achieving with different combinations of number of learning episodes and percentage of social learning. So it's the same axes as we've been seeing before. Now the colors just show the fitness that's achieved by populations in that region of parameter space. And right away on this fitness landscape, you can see a peak here in the peer individual learning strategy, a large peak here in the social learning strategy with this fitness valley in between them. And also there's this local optimum here against the y-axis, the no learning strategy, where no learning is better than doing a little bit of learning in most of this space. To get some idea of how populations are moving through and navigating this fitness landscape, basically I just drew these arbitrary lines and calculated for every 100 generations, a population in one region, what's the probability that it will stay in that region after 100 generations or move to another region? And that's all shown in this figure on the left with the arrows denoting the probability of transitioning between regions and the underlined lines denoting the probability of staying. And I think the most notable flow here is that even after 20,000 generations of evolution, there's a 4% chance that population in the social learning strategy moves into the individual learning strategy and vice versa. So even after 20,000 generations, these populations are still really exploring the environment and moving around quite a bit, or exploring the parameter space, I should say. And this is quite interesting. If we actually look at the fitnesses for these different attractors, the individual learning, social learning, and no learning attractor, the social learning strategy does provide slightly higher fitness. And yet a lot of populations still wind up in the local optima of individual learning and no learning. And I think there's one interesting thing going on under the hood there. If you look at the number of genes required to use each of these strategies, the no learning strategy requires 34 genes, only the neural network weights and biases, and the gene for the percentage of social learning for the learning rates can just drift around. The individual learning strategy, for that to work, it needs to have all 34 network genes under selection and fine-tuned, but also the gene for percentage of social learning, the gene for the number of learning episodes, and the learning rate for individual learning have to be fine-tuned. And the social learning strategy requires 39 genes, the same as above, but also the schedule gene and a learning rate for social learning. So I think there's some balance here between the simplicity of the strategy, which makes it more attractive, and the fitness gained by the strategy, which makes it more attractive. And the reason that the individual learning strategy is persistent is in part because it's a little bit simpler than the social learning strategy to evolve and maintain. So a couple last results really quick. I don't want to dig into this too much, but one question is, do these networks actually evolve to learn? We tested evolved networks that where the whole network evolved against just randomly generated networks, and then made them learn 25 learning episodes with either 100% individual learning or 25% social learning with either of the two social learning implementations. And you can see that the evolved networks in red achieve a higher performance than just the random networks. That shows that the learning isn't just something that's happening and is effective. The learning is only really effective when the network itself has evolved to be able to learn. So the upstream parts of the network are evolving, those weights and biases are changing in order to make learning more effective. And another way to show this in an even messier chaotic plot, we look to see in these top panels, we allow the whole network to evolve like we've been doing for this whole presentation. In the bottom panels, we randomly initialized the beginning part of the network and only allowed the last 4 weights to evolve. And similar strategies emerge when only the last 4 weights evolve, but with a lot lower fitness, lower performance. And that just shows us that it's not only these 4 learning weights that have to evolve for learning to be effective, it's actually the whole network evolving in order for learning to work and be effective. So those are the results. To put it all back together, our initial goal here was to test whether this consensus view built on models of replicative social learning applies to reconstructive social learning. And we can say that for the most part, it does. But for imitative social learning, at least, the learning schedule is absolutely essential for social learning to evolve. And it's also notable that where social learning does evolve, individual learning strategies also evolve too and do just about as well. So it's not like it's a global attractor where in this intermediately stable environment, only social learning is an effective strategy. It's just about as good as a pure individual learning strategy, which suggests something about reconstructive social learning, that the lack of fidelity of the social transmission process via reconstruction really impedes social learning from evolving. But kind of the flip side of that is that guided social learning evolves really readily. It kind of takes the best of both worlds. It gets teachers to give individual learners the cues that are likely to be most informative, but then the learners do individual learning on those cues. So the learning process is very reliable. This is similar to stimulus enhancement, which is where social learning occurs by a demonstrator drawing the attention of the learner to some stimulus, and then the learner individually learns on that. So that's something like a chimpanzee makes a tool to maybe fish algae from a pond, and then it drops that tool, and another chimpanzee picks it up. And now, because they've been exposed to that stimulus, they're more likely to individually learn how to do that thing on their own. It's interesting that our implementation of guided social learning was really effective, but it's not really considered in most models of the evolution of learning. I think these results suggest that it should really be thought about in the spectrum of social learning strategies. And finally, my favorite result here is that social learning, imitative and guided, evolved without reducing the cost per episode of social learning. In the replicative models, that's the main benefit often the only benefit of social learning is that it's just cheaper than individual learning. But we show even when it costs the same, it can still evolve. And that's because the benefit is that the teachers are selecting the information that the learners are getting. So it's not that it's cheaper to do an episode of it, but it's that the actual information that you're learning from is more specific and refined and tailored to be more useful. Um, so yeah, that's what I've got. This was published a few months ago in Scientific Reports. And I'm excited to hear what you guys think.
Great, thanks so much. Questions, comments, everybody?
Hi, thanks for the presentation. Just a clarification question, maybe I missed this. So in your social learning case, are the teachers also part of the population that is evolved? So the teachers are they also evolve?
Yeah, the teachers are just individuals from the parental generation.
So
So
the parental generation.
it's
Okay.
non-overlapping generations, but you can think about the T-1 generation, the parental generation, sticking around to teach. So the teachers
So
do
the best
evolve.
individuals.
Uh,
So the best individuals of the previous generation are like the teachers. Is that how it works? Or
Yeah, initially without the success bias, it's just random individuals from the parental generation. And then once we incorporated the success bias, then it's the best individuals from the parental generation. Exactly.
okay, cool.
Is there any notion here of intentional misleading or lying? Is the system right? So as you're out there trying to learn from others, could there be pressures, evolutionary pressures or whatever, to not tell you everything that they know, basically? And what would it take to modify the system to include that kind of thing? Because like here, if I'm not mistaken, here the assumption is that whatever anybody's trying to teach you, it's sort of the best information they have to offer you, right? That it's, you take everything literally. Whatever you're seeing somebody else do, you take that literally. The question is there, is there a scenario where the others are basically the difference between learning and being trained, right? Is that you can, they might be actually behavior shaping you for whatever purpose of their own.
That's an amazing point. I had never thought of that, but it's super interesting. We could test that by allowing teachers to be the parents, the actual genetic parents of the learners, in which case their incentives would be aligned. Because I suppose in the current model, the teachers are teaching non-relatives who are competing with their actual genetic offspring.
Right.
So that could actually be weakening and influencing selection on the learning and teaching process. That's a super fascinating point I hadn't thought of.
And even if these are your own offspring, you might like in biology, there's all these maternal effect kinds of things where the things that happen to you are because the mother did certain things to make different embryos be different. So for example, you might decide, if you have n children, you might decide that half of them should learn this and half of them should learn that as a better strategy versus letting them all learn the same thing. And that could, you could use that to either spread out your risk or try to exploit multiple, I don't know, multiple attractors in the landscape, all that kind of stuff. And so again, you could be basically like in addition to lateral competition, you could be hacking your children with specific kinds of, I mean, that's a common thing, of course, right? Using education to bend the next generation in ways that you hope will be adaptive.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I can imagine bet hedging strategies evolving. Genetically, you can imagine a bet hedging strategy is just like a pretty flat prior by the neural networks. But you could also imagine bet hedging strategies evolving by the teachers, influencing their children to have slightly different predictions. And I think that would be most likely if the environment was changing even faster. The way we have non-overlapping generations, the environment can only change in between generations. But in cases where the environment changes multiple times within an individual's lifetime, then I think you expect more sort of bet hedging strategies to evolve. Because the value of learning decreases a lot if the environment is constantly changing. If I learn something today and the environment changes tomorrow and then again the next day. It might be better just to have a kind of uniform prior rather than actually spending time and energy learning. Um, yeah.
I mean, another thing you could do is kind of close the loop on all this and have the strategy that you use to okay, knowing that others are watching you and learning from you, the strategy of what do you expose to them could also be encoded as the outcome of the network. So you could be simultaneously learning not just the behaviors, but also kind of the meta learning of, okay, and how much of my wisdom do I share and with whom? And so I can't do that in my head to know what the outcomes would be, but I think you'll get some interesting loops if you do that.
Yeah, I think that would be a cool way to go forward is allowing either another network or different parts of the network to evolve to influence the learning and teaching strategies so they could be a bit more sophisticated. I kind of think that it'll be different. It'll be difficult to get really interesting kind of cultural evolution and very specific teaching strategies evolving with this simple of an environment. We tested three different like distributions of this bell-shaped curve from really wide to really narrow, but it's still just a bell-shaped curve. And I think that if the environment were to be very jagged and have a lot of little peaks, there would be really interesting things going on where an individual learner couldn't learn the environment well, and teachers might want to teach them very specific complex parts of the environment. But that's all future directions where this might go. Um,
Yeah, that's also a question I want to ask because I don't know how do you sample the queue because for example some queue might be low reward and the agent might not explore enough. So if you te learn from teacher, you might not learn you might not been trained enough. In humans case, we when we ask want to learn from other people. They're often we're trying to learn something that we are not familiar with. We know we don't know it, so we learn from people. I don't know how do you do this in your work?
yeah, I think that that does to some extent fit into this work where the learner picks the cue that they learn from. So the learner is exposed, they're given 10 cues, and they pick the cue with the highest prediction, the highest predicted quality, and then they learn from that cue. And so the learner is kind of doing like a local search around what they already think is the important part of the environment. And the teachers can instead like point them, oh, the peak of the environment is over here, you're way off. We did try also where instead of the learners picking the cues they learn from, they also just get random cues assigned. And surprisingly, there wasn't that big of a difference, except that they do a little bit more learning if they get random cues, but the same strategies evolve in the same places. Um, but yeah, I think that the way that the learner picks their own cue kind of captures this local search. You're going to keep trying things that you already think are pretty good. A teacher can tell you that you're totally far from the optimum and you've got to come way over here.
Thank you. Interesting. Yeah, I always thought maybe some phenomena was from the sampling, but you said that there's no big difference.
The largest difference is when the environment is really narrow. Um, when the environment's very narrow, then they do, and they have random cues assigned to them, then they do a ton of learning episodes because it's basically really hard for them to find some cues that are actually on the environmental peak. But yeah, surprisingly, I think in other cases, random versus self-selected cues don't make much of a difference.
Yeah, that's interesting because if you imagine parents or teacher teach some people, they often also emphasize some rarer case like like your driving teacher might teach you something that you will never experience during driving, but they also teach you. Uh, yeah, I just thinking maybe it's possible to give higher weights for some low quality case to let you know that it's bad.
Mm.
Maybe, oh, I realize maybe the quality is depend on how you scale the quality because sometimes some queue are deadly instead of
Mm.
no reward. So the quality might be like negative infinite if you consider something that cause deaths, then that might lead to some difference.
That's a great suggestion. Yeah, I've thought about that, having part of the environmental curve dip into the negative, so that, well, at least for foraging, that if they sample cues really far from the peak, it actually harms their fitness a lot. That would be to try to incorporate the idea that like learning can be risky. If you're a
Yeah.
rat and you're trying different foods to figure out which one's the best, like it's not just wasted time. Some of those foods might be poisonous.
Yes. So
Yeah.
the reason I mentioned negative infinite is because uh, uh, the process is not summation of reward. Because once you have something that causes you death, there's no chance to get your future. So it's a multiplication. So you reward is a multiplication, like your initially you're one, and maybe next time you multiply by two, by three, but one day if you eat something poisoning, you multiply zero, you get
Mm.
everything gets zero. So if you
Hmm.
want to turn it to summation, you're doing logarithm, and logarithm, zero in logarithm is negative infinite.
Hmm.
That's the reason why I suggest maybe the quality can goes down far to negative infinite in some extreme case.
That's interesting. Yeah. I don't have a good intuition for how that would change the strategies that evolve. Um, suppose that the animals would evolve to be more conservative and do less exploration. I don't know if it would increase or decrease the reliance on social learning, though. That's interesting.
Yeah, that's also some kind of a passive social learning, because when in human society, if you saw some people doing eat something poisoning, the
Hmm.
people die, and though that people who died cannot teach you, but you still
Yeah.
learn the activity. So if you consider some case that lead to negative infinite quality, then you need some kind of this kind of learning in order to learn from those activity.
Yeah. I like that point. I think that probably the environment just needs to be more complex and more interesting than just a single peaked bell curve like it is now. And a lot of these sorts of things could be incorporated.
Yeah.
Another, sorry, Ben, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, great talk so far. Um, do have a philosophical question, because you mentioned that if the environment is changing very quickly, um, you reduce the rate of social learning quite heavily. It reminded me a little bit of the current situation in academic publication, because whenever you read a paper, the next day you see tons of papers or more on a month, which bring the field forward so quickly, which makes it difficult to keep track, actually. Do you have any intuition where we are currently in the individual or social learning phase, or how this might evolve in the future scientifically?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of this comes to an exploration exploitation trade-off. Um, and in academia, we certainly face that, where there's some risk to trying out to forage into a new sub-discipline, but the rewards might also be good. Whereas there's a lot lower risk of just doing the kind of work that everybody else is doing. Um, you're probably going to have a fine career, but you're a lot less likely to discover something really novel. Um, and I guess social learning really occurs at every aspect of the scientific process, but mostly when I mean, yeah, I mean, I've never really thought about it in the context of academia, but hmm.
Well, it's good to have a group which works on similar things, because then you can cover a bigger spectrum and probably mention important stuff to others. But currently, it's really weird. It's like the Wild West almost. So you see so many papers, especially in the AI field, for instance, that yeah, if we're getting close to the real intelligence explosion, I don't know how to keep up in the social learning environment, so to say, so to keep a scientific community alive, so to say, in that environment.
Yeah, so the explosion, there's some burden. There's so much social information that you can't take in all of it. Yeah, that's interesting. But I don't know how it maps onto environmental change, and maybe you have some idea.
Yeah,
In
I
the
also need to think about it. So
social learning in
really
this
interesting
model
stuff.
and in this literature is less useful than environmental change because, what you learn one day might not be useful the next day. And there probably is some of that actually in the AI work today. Like I've been to quite a few AI talks where they put up all these results of like GPT 3.0 and what it was doing compared to these other models. And it's like, it's hard to see how this is going to be relevant in 3 years' time. And that's kind of, I guess that maps onto the environmental change rate being high. And so using social learning gives you more outdated information um, than individual learning, which is doing your own research in this context, I suppose. Publishing based on the newest AI models rather than one from a couple years ago. But I don't know. There's
Yeah.
also a lot of fields of science where some of the major developments don't change so rapidly. In a lot of fields of evolutionary biology, we have the same general schemes we've had for like 30 years.
Yeah, good point. Anyway, it's an interesting way how to think about that perspective. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, just had another clarification question. So is the cost of learning part of your fitness function, or
Um,
or is it just fitness equals it performance?
it's this. So they do this foraging. Um, 500 minus the number of learning episode times. So I think of 500 as the lifespan. And they spend part of their lifespan doing learning. So maybe they do 20 learning episodes. Then they would do this foraging process 480 times. And then we just accumulate all of the energy that they gain from the cues they forage. So in this way, there is the exploration exploitation trade-off that the more they learn, the more they invest in exploration and trying to find a perfect prediction of the environment, but then the less time they have to exploit. So that's how we've incorporated the cost. And the per episode cost initially was the same for individual and social learning. But in the later improvements, I made social learning cheaper. And that surprisingly had very little impact.
I guess it would be helpful to have to project the fitness onto a performance versus cost of learning space so that we can map the different learners, right? Presumably the individual learners would show high performance at though the high cost of learning, but social learners would have low cost of learning, but maybe sufficiently high performance, and maybe that way you can get a better idea of which learning
Yeah.
strategy is kind of optimal.
Yeah, for like all of these plots and this landscape, I tried plotting performance and also fitness to look at the differences and get some ideas. And like it's very clear,
Okay.
here the social learning strategy and individual learning strategy have a lot higher performance than the no learning strategy. That doesn't necessarily mean they have higher fitness. In this case, they do, uh, as you can see in the fitness landscape. But like
Okay.
way back for the results of like just individual learning, like here I have performance plotted. The learners in this population have higher performance than the non-learners. Uh, but actually the fitness is pretty much similar. I don't remember exactly what it was, but the fitness is close. Yeah. So
I see.
alternative strategies to
Okay.
achieve similar fitness.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
I might have missed this, but ways to quantify infotaxis in this thing. So like the active search for information, is that anything you can quantify here?
Yeah, so I think one limitation of this implementation is that in individual learning, they pick the cue themselves, but that strategy doesn't evolve. It's just they're offered 10 cues and they pick the one with the highest expected quality. In social learning, the teacher picks the cue, but there's no way in which the actual cue picking strategy is under selection except in the balance between individual learning and social learning. So I think that if you want to think about it in terms of infotaxis, like social learning is a more exploratory strategy because the teacher is more likely to give them a cue that they wouldn't have picked themselves. Um, you can certainly imagine cases in which the actual cue selection was under selection and in which they could evolve strategies to go and, pick a cue that has low expected quality. The reason that we went with this, like the learners pick a cue with high expected quality, is because that's the most similar to the way that we implemented social learning. So we wanted to try to minimize the number of differences between individual learning and social learning and, have the only difference be to the social aspect of it. But I do think that allowing cue selection to evolve would be an interesting way to really allow them to hone their exploration strategy.
Very cool.
Yeah, I think this whole thing could be viewed as as a form of Markovian process. I think because in the individual learners, right, they depend on the current generation, but the social learning requires the previous generation as well. So that would make it sort of non-Markovian, whereas individual learning is memoryless. And so maybe if you can think of generalizing it even further, where teachers of teachers can also influence future generations. So that would just introduce more and more memory, and maybe there is an optimal range of memory that maximizes the fitness. Maybe too much memory is also not good,
I think that's a really interesting idea, and specifically, like if every generation is basically interpreting the information of the previous one, then as offspring, number whatever, you might say, you know what, I don't know if my parents got the information correct. Let me go back to my grandparents or my great grandparents and see if I can make of it myself. So it also has to do with how much trust you have versus, what's the value at some point after so some number of generations have gone on, so things might be different now, and you might say maybe it's worthwhile for me to revisit some information from the deep past that maybe wasn't correctly or optimally encoded down to me.
But wouldn't this also require reteaching parents and grandparents if the environment changes to make this more efficient even?
Yeah, I'm
Which
not
is
sure.
costly for the older ones, but still.
But by the way, could just as a factual thing in this system, there's only one generation alive at a time, or there's multiple generations alive?
Well, there's just the learning generation is alive, and then the teachers are around to still teach, but they don't reproduce anymore. So,
but are there grandparents, great grandparents? Like if you wanted to pick tutors from many generations ago, they're not there anymore, right? In this scenario,
not the way it's implemented, but it'd be easy to implement that. But yeah, it's not like that now. Yeah. Yeah, these are awesome points. I really like the idea of thinking about like how far back in time you want to have your memory. I think that's culture. This consistent transmission of a suite of socially transmitted information. And cultural evolution, we didn't really see occurring in this model, but again, the task is so simple that anything that culture can evolve to learn, an individual can just learn on their own in a lifetime. So that's again where I want to make the environment really complex. And then you could imagine a lot of cases in which it might take 30 generations of learning and passing on via teaching that information to like approximate a little part of the network that's very very complicated. So yeah, that would be the way to really bring this into the world of cultural evolution. This is kind of like a preliminary test of this model to see if it works. And even just with this, the paper is like 40 pages long. So I really like this idea though of thinking about it in terms of the depth of memory. Yeah.
Maybe mention it before. I'm not sure. So let me ask it in a way in a questionable way. Assuming, for example, that you mentioned that you select a teacher as part of the population, right? Sometime randomly. What will
Yeah.
happen if you take all of your teachers as a part of the population? What will happen?
You mean if you learn from every individual?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I did think initially that it would be important whether you learn from one teacher or many teachers. And
Or not even many teacher. Every generation you specifically randomly take one of the teachers in the population. What will happen?
well, I'm not sure I understand. I mean, currently when they socially learn, they pick one teacher for each social learning episode.
Right.
They do
Okay.
20 social learning episodes, they pick 20 different teachers.
So in this scenario, and I'm trying to understand why the population advance, because if the population itself already learned, let's say the other individual learned something that the other individual didn't learn, so it will eventually learn that. And it will reach to a point that anyone else learn exactly what everyone else know. Why there going to be a new information that need to be learned and advanced?
Yeah, okay, I understand. That's a good question. Um, so the populations we do see are actually pretty monomorphic. If you plot like every single neural network's output in a population, they look pretty similar, which means that the population mostly kind of knows the same thing. But the reason that they keep learning is that the environment changes. So, even if in a few generations the population can approximate the environment pretty well, and then the environment changes in 5 generations, they need to learn again. If the environment never changes, then learning is just not useful at all because just the genetic selection of the networks can predict the environment like perfectly.
Right, but that's why you have the no learning group, which is the environment change and they not learning from social, right? But they do learn.
Well, yeah, okay, you could say the population learns and that the population evolves, but it doesn't actually do any learning. Uh, Individuals don't do any learning when the environment doesn't change at all.
So what will happen if the individual will do try to learn?
Well,
Because because I'm trying to understand to only do a one step between the different categories. That one step should be the social learning. So there is supposed to be a step where they learn individually which environment change to see if what will be the delta of the social environment in social learning.
I'm really sorry. I'm not sure I totally understand the question.
You mentioned that in my question that the individual will learn from others. They continue learning because the environment change.
Yes.
So if, for example, the environment change and they're not going to learn from each other, what will happen? Is that equivalent to the no learning group, or is some different? Is
Okay.
there a group there that we don't see it?
Well, like here we see these 3 different strategies. Some populations evolve the social learning, some evolve the individual learning, some evolve no learning. So like in the no learning populations, when the environment changes, the fitness of the population just goes down because all of the networks predict an environment that's different than the actual environment. But then given a few generations, just by like the genetic algorithm, those networks have a pretty good prediction of the environment again. Um, in the individual
Even
learning,
they didn't learn socially.
no. I mean, in these results, the y-axis shows the percentage of social learning. The x-axis shows the number of learning episodes. So like in all of these populations, which is like, I think 10% of them, the number of learning episodes is 0 or close to 0. So they just don't do any learning at all. And they just let the population take a hit, go to really low fitness, and then just recover in a few generations by natural selection. There's also these populations here that just evolve individual learning. They don't do any social learning. And when the environment changes, or whether or not it changes, they'll do like 20 learning episodes and just not use any social information.